Hello and welcome to the Homeless Consultants channel. My name is Paul B. I am the Homeless Consultant. Today I am going to put together everything that I have put into my 50 Greatest Existential Threats to America series, my coronavirus videos, and my video series Computer Models 101 for government officials. I'm going to put everything together into one concise statement. To ensure that I don't leave anything out because this is important, I'm going to read this one to you. So let's get started. What I'm going to talk about here is how Minnesota is the key to understanding coronavirus, or the coronavirus phenomenon. Minnesotans were willing to sacrifice an awful lot in the fight against coronavirus. For example, they were willing to sacrifice a booming, prosperous economy. Gone. Their jobs, in many cases, gone. Their children's educations. Kids aren't going to school. Their hard-earned small businesses. Their ability to pay bills. They were willing to default on debts. They were willing to be unable to fulfill their responsibility to support their own families. They were willing to have their hard-earned possessions sold for pennies on the dollar just to stay afloat. They were willing, in many cases, to lose their homes, to join the ranks of the homeless. They were willing to lose their natural, God-given rights. They were willing to give up their civil liberties. They were willing to give up the United States Constitution, which protects us all from tyranny, oppression, dehumanization, and slavery to the dictates of an elite few, all of which is ultimately enforced at the end of a loaded gun. And they were willing to sacrifice higher taxes in the future to cover for the total loss of Minnesota's budget surplus. Now, in addition to that, they were also willing to set these examples for their children, for the next generation, with inescapable crystal clarity that will never be forgotten by that generation who observed how these adults behaved. Fear and panic, rather than courage and clear-headed common sense, should control one's attitudes, beliefs, decisions, behaviors, and action. The children were taught by example, rather than taking responsibility for your own life and for your own safety, you should abdicate those responsibilities to government, which is comprised of nothing more than a bunch of random yahoos who have no better idea what they're doing than anyone else does. They set this example for their children. You do not have to work for a living for yourself. You can always apply for unemployment, welfare, or receive stimulus checks from the government. You do not need an education. If something comes along that is more important, you can just stay home from school indefinitely. What you see in the mainstream media is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Believe it without question. Do not ever question what you are told. That's what the children have learned by example. Experts know what they're doing. Respect them. Believe them, obey them, and accept higher taxes to fund them. And the last thing the children learned by observing their elders in this event was that the U.S. Constitution is absolutely meaningless. Minnesotans were even willing to give up the one thing that makes life worth living for a social species: close social interactions with fellow human beings. Instead, almost overnight, they replaced that purpose for our existence with the polar opposite: social distancing. They even yelled and screamed or called the police when a fellow human approached them. The Minnesota news media did everything possible to maintain the full intensity of what happened on the morning of 9/11, not just for one day, but for an entire month, and counting. All in a desperate attempt to become relevant and profitable again, as people have finally been realizing over the past several years that our news media is controlled and deceitful. It's full of myths and lies. It's an enemy of the people. The Minnesota news media behaved that desperately, and Minnesotans sacrificed all of the things I just listed in response to an unseen, vague threat that's not particularly unusual. It's constantly changing in what they tell us about it, and it's filled with assumptions, doubt, and unknowns, except for one certainty, just one. The vast majority of people who get coronavirus survive it just fine. In fact, many people never even knew that they had it. The stock market crashed out of nothing more than media-driven fear, while elected government officials on civil servant salaries made millions of dollars by selling short. Yet Minnesotans did nothing to demand their resignation, their prosecution, or their imprisonment of these corrupt government officials. It was more important to focus on saving lives during this unprecedented crisis. Likewise, Minnesotans had nothing to say as communist China bought many of those stocks for pennies on the dollar via front organizations, basically conquering America's most crucial infrastructure, the foundation of our economy, our freedom, independence, sovereignty, and prosperity, all without firing a shot. Minnesotans had nothing to say about that. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz was elected to serve the people of Minnesota. He was not elected to usurp unconstitutional powers and become a master who can even dictate who is allowed to earn a living and who is not. Yet he was willing to inflict all of this devastation, all this misery, all this pain and suffering on Minnesotans on the sole basis of public health experts whose competence, credibility, benevolence has been in serious question for at least the past 60 years. As my YouTube video series, Computer Models 101 for Government Officials, clearly shows, Minnesota's stay-at-home order actually obliterates the very purpose of contagious disease computer models, because we lose all of the forensic data that is needed to verify and validate, hone, and improve those models for the benefit of future generations. In the context of any other national disaster, that precise behavior is called tampering with evidence. It's a felony crime. But Governor Walz was willing to do it anyway, all in the interest of saving lives. Through it all, most Minnesotans accepted this sudden destruction of our modern civilization, which is comparable in scale and scope to a surprise nuclear attack, for one reason, and one reason only: to save lives. The same fear-motivated mantra that public health experts have used to impose endless draconian rules, regulations, restrictions, laws, taxes, and social engineering on the American people over the last 60 years, without being elected to public office. Everything from smoking bans to ruthlessly exorbitant tobacco taxes, to trans fat bans, to carbon taxes, to the current movement to force people to inject vaccines into their bodies against their will when they don't have the foggiest idea what is actually in those vaccines. And through it all, Minnesotans I have spoken with over the past month have been walking around like defeated zombies, repeatedly saying things like, "I can't believe this. This is just surreal. This doesn't make any sense." They also repeat one other thing: this is unprecedented. Yet this is not unprecedented at all. And therein lies the key to understanding the coronavirus health scare. You see, there has always been contagious disease in this world, even new ones. Does anybody remember AIDS? There have always been epidemics, and more rarely, there have always been pandemics. Furthermore, humans have always died. In fact, until the last century, most of the human species that ever existed on this planet never lived anywhere near as long as we do already, even when we, quote, die young. Again, I repeat, the primary reason why Minnesotans allowed all of this devastation to honest and ordinary, hard-working people's lives was to, quote, save lives. It was obviously very important to them that lives were saved, even if they had to sacrifice everything they worked their entire lives for, everything that makes life worth living, to save those lives. The question is, whose lives were they really trying to save? On the surface, it sure does sound like Minnesotans are incredibly noble and altruistic. They're willing to give up everything that they and their ancestors worked for and fought to earn, just so that an unknown number of random strangers can live for a little while longer before they eventually die anyway. Indeed, the consistent response from Minnesotans to protests against the stay-at-home order has been, "How dare you take the risk of killing so many people by gathering in public like that?" One Minnesota business owner was even featured in the newspaper on the public record saying, quote, "I know I'm going to lose my business, but I still believe the stay-at-home order is worth it, to save lives." Yes, Minnesotans have surely behaved like angelic benefactors of humanity throughout this entire crisis, haven't they? Other people matter so much to them that they're happy to sacrifice absolutely everything to ensure that other people are well cared for. Except for one little thing. If you watch my video, The 50 Greatest Existential Threats to America, you'll find that one of them is what I call the homeless holocaust. Minnesota currently has at least 19,601 homeless people. Because of their living conditions, they have twice the mortality rate of the general population. Not for years has this gone on, but for decades. Those homeless Minnesotans have suffered in the unfathomable misery of third world conditions in the midst of so much prosperity amongst the general population, who do absolutely nothing of real substance to help the homeless. As my videos on the Homeless Consultant channel have shown over the past several years, even Minnesota churches slam their doors in homeless people's faces. At best, churches provide a few gestures of food and clothing before they hand them a list of government social services where the homeless may go to find salvation. But as my Homeless Consultant videos have demonstrated for years, Minnesota social services is a complete farce. It's a ludicrous waste of time and energy, human potential, tax dollars. Social services do more harm to the homeless than help. And at best, they provide a small number of token homeless with government housing that the homeless people themselves describe as, quote, a prison. Funding social services is one of the largest parts of the Minnesota state budget. Yet the only ones who truly benefit from this are social service administrators and workers, who are too negligent and incompetent to work themselves out of a job by saving other people's lives. Instead, all of that funding merely ensures their job security, their ability to maintain a home, their ability to pay their bills, their prestige in society, and their prosperity, their ability to have a family of their own. Meanwhile, the homeless just suffer and die off camera. Those 19,601 or more homeless people suffer and die off camera because Minnesota news media consistently refuses to tell anyone the truth about the hellish conditions that homeless people experience day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. The Minnesota news media also consistently refuses to expose the government negligence, incompetence, and corruption that wastes billions of tax dollars on this pointless farce of social services. Instead, on rare occasions, the Minnesota news media suddenly, out of nowhere, just out of nowhere, publishes some heartwarming story about how one homeless person or one homeless family received a little bit of help, to give the impression that all 19,000 or more homeless people are receiving the assistance they need, on a daily basis. The media never follows up on those stories later to reveal that a little help usually has no long-term impact for the homeless person that they profiled. Coronavirus is an invisible, vague threat. Nobody has the slightest idea who it might strike next. The homeless, however, are very real and easily identified human beings. Every single one of those 19,601 or more homeless Minnesotans have names. They have life stories. They want to enjoy a life worth living. They are suffering and dying in conditions that only the third world can relate to. Unlike this vague threat of coronavirus, the Minnesota news media has never once devoted endless 24-hour news coverage to saving those homeless people's lives until the job gets done. Yet it would be relatively easy to accomplish this if Minnesotans cared enough about other people to sacrifice just a little bit, not a lot, but just a little, collectively, to help the homeless. But Minnesotans don't do that. Minnesotans won't do that. Minnesotans are repulsed by the very suggestion that they should do that. Instead, they tend to exhibit osteo-phobia. They hate and fear the homeless. They're disgusted by the homeless. They blame the victims to avoid even the slightest culpability on their part as irresponsible and self-absorbed citizens who finance this dehumanizing, sick and twisted social service juggernaut, which accomplishes absolutely nothing of substance to help the homeless. My homeless consultant channel videos here have documented this right in front of your eyes for several years now. In other words, the very continued existence of so many homeless people in Minnesota is proof positive that Minnesotans do not give the slightest trace of a damn about other people. Their very existence, ongoing, proves it. When you consider the sheer magnitude of human suffering that is involved in homelessness versus the relatively trivial sacrifices that would be needed to save them, it's more than obvious that Minnesotans do not care about other people. They only care about themselves. If spending one day a year handing out used clothes and food to homeless people makes them feel like they have helped the homeless, that services their own needs, their own desires, their own egos. It does nothing to save the homeless. With Minnesotans, it is all about them, me, myself, and I. And that, my friends, is the key to understanding what is happening with this coronavirus scare. Minnesotans are willing to sacrifice absolutely everything, even the character of their own children who are observing the way they respond to this, not to save other people's lives, but to save their own lives. They don't want to get coronavirus. They don't want to suffer. They don't want to die. Suffering and dying are perfectly acceptable for other people, but not for them. There is simply no way to escape the truth here, folks. A minimal sacrifice from Minnesotans spread out over a period of time would have saved countless homeless people's lives once and for all. My suffering would have been over if they had just tried. Yet all they did instead was nothing. Absolutely nothing. But when a problem suddenly appeared that threatened to affect them personally, why, they were perfectly willing to sacrifice absolutely everything that makes life worth living. And they sacrificed it all immediately, all at once, without any hesitation whatsoever, to save their own lives. The Minnesota news media could have focused on the homeless problem every single day until all of the homeless were saved. Just like they can't stop talking about coronavirus now. But they never did that, did they? They never even attempted to do that. Instead, the Minnesota news media engaged in a sporadic, self-serving propaganda campaign that pretended to care about the homeless, while it only served their interests. Meanwhile, the homeless themselves were left to suffer and die off camera. Always off camera. So if Minnesotans want to understand why we have lost everything that makes life worth living, and why we sacrifice the very character of our next generation almost overnight in this coronavirus health scare, there is only one place you need to look to find the answer. In a mirror. It was all about saving your life all along, not saving the lives of random, faceless other people who might die of coronavirus. Maybe, possibly, we're not really sure. Minnesotans did not even attempt to save their nearly 20,000 homeless people whom they can easily identify. Starting with the homeless man who is speaking to you right now. Nobody has done a thing to try to help. And in case you're wondering about that business owner who went on public record saying that he supports the stay-at-home order, even if that means losing his business, consider this. Whenever an individual or a group or an organization gets featured like that in the news media, there is suddenly a brief but substantial flood of public support that follows. You know, they suddenly receive offers of assistance, donations, and people setting up GoFundMe campaigns to help out this wonderful, selfless, altruistic person or organization who went on camera to claim that they would gladly sacrifice everything to save just one person's life. It's a pretty safe bet that the Minnesotan who was about to lose his business probably understood that very well-known phenomenon before he decided to go on camera. You see, he can get on camera, but the homeless, we just suffer and die off camera. In Minnesota, the news media has laughed in my face whenever I've asked them to tell the truth about homelessness and social services in Minnesota. That's all they've done. That's it. And they always do it off camera, where you cannot see the kinds of people they really are. You only see them all dolled up on television. And simply put, that is why you are witnessing everything that has happened in this coronavirus scare. It's all about saving lives, all right. You better believe it. It's about saving the lives of Minnesotans who only care about themselves. It's about saving me, myself, and I, and damn the consequences for everyone else, including the next generation. The proof of this was right in front of you all along, folks. It was staring you right in the face. Nearly 20,000 homeless Minnesotans suffer and die, ongoing, all the time, day after day, never ending. And Governor Walz's response was not to save their lives. His response was an unconstitutional executive stay-at-home order that specifically targets the working homeless for total destruction. The homeless cannot stay at home. And using a silly euphemism like shelter in place rather than stay at home does not change that reality. If you live in one of the 49 other U.S. states, I urge you to carefully consider how this example of demonic, self-serving inhumanity in Minnesota might help to explain what you have witnessed over the past month in your own state. I urge you to turn off your television, turn off your computer, turn off your phone, and think long and hard about what has really happened here and why it happened. And don't forget to have that mirror handy. Because, folks, it was not a virus that did that to us. Thank you for watching.